people think about powerful countries, they usually imagine countries with obvious advantages: land, resources, population, and geography. The kinds of things that are supposed to make nations strong. And if you looked at Southeast Asia in the 1960s, Singapore had almost none of them. Around it were countries with scale and natural wealth. Indonesia had oil, gas, timber, and one of the largest populations in the world. Malaysia had farmland, minerals, rubber, and land stretching across entire regions. But Singapore was different. It was small, overcrowded, and resource poor, and was even dependent on others for water. By almost every natural measure, it looked weak. And yet today, Singapore is richer than both, safer than both, and more efficient than both. It became one of the richest countries on earth, not because it had more, but because it built it differently. And much of that transformation happened under one man, Lee Kuan Yew, a leader praised for building a nation but criticized for controlling it, because the same discipline that helped build Singapore also restricted it. And that contradiction is what makes this story so important, because Singapore forces a different question: what actually makes a country succeed? What it has, or how it's governed? To answer that, you have to go back to when Singapore wasn't a success story. It wasn't even a country, just a port. Singapore's story doesn't begin with independence. It begins with empire. In 1819, Stamford Raffles arrived on behalf of the British East India Company. He wasn't interested in Singapore because of the resources. There were none. What mattered was where it sat. Singapore was positioned along the most important trade route in the world, between India and China. In the 19th century, controlling trade meant controlling wealth. So the British built a port, and that port changed everything. People began arriving from across Asia: Chinese workers, Indian laborers, Malay traders, Arab merchants, and European businessmen. Singapore became a crossroads of empire, a place people came to work, trade, and survive, not necessarily to belong. And over time, the Chinese population became the majority, not through conquest, but through migration and commerce. That demographic reality would shape Singapore's politics for decades. But colonial prosperity had limits. The port generated wealth, but much of that wealth flowed outward, back into the British Empire. Singapore became efficient at trade, logistics, and finance, but it still didn't control its own future. Still without realizing it, Singapore was developing the exact skill it would one day depend on: building value without natural resources. And among the children growing up in that world was Lee Kuan Yew, because the empire that built Singapore would eventually collapse. And when it did, everything changed. For decades, Britain had sold Singapore the promise of security. It was supposed to be protected, defended, untouchable. They called it the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress in Asia. But in 1942, that illusion collapsed. Fall of Singapore. Japan invaded and British defenses fell with shocking speed. More than 80,000 troops surrendered in what remains one of Britain's worst military defeats. For the people living there, it changed everything. Because when a power that seems permanent collapses in days, permanence stops feeling real. What followed was occupation, and occupation was brutal, especially for the Chinese population. Executions, food shortages, disappearance. Fear became normal, and among those living through it was young Lee Kuan Yew. He watched institutions collapse. He watched power disappear. And he learned something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Order is fragile, and once it breaks, rebuilding it is far harder than maintaining it. That lesson would shape almost everything he did later. After the war, Lee went to Britain. He studied law at the London School of Economics and later at the University of Cambridge. But law wasn't the only thing he was studying. He was studying systems, how government functioned, how institutions create trust, how order is maintained, and Britain showed him something more important. Its power wasn't just wealth. Its power came from institutions that worked: courts, bureaucracies, administration, rules people trusted, and trust created stability. But Lee also saw the contradiction. Britain spoke about liberty and democracy, while ruling colonials that had neither. That hypocrisy mattered, because Lee came away believing something practical. Good intentions are not enough, and a country needs systems. And systems need discipline. In 1954, he founded the People's Action Party.
I won't be here, but people like me and like my friends here tonight will be here. Recognizable, unidentifiable 1,000 years from hence.
And unlike many colonial movements, his path wasn't armed rebellion. It was politics, elections, negotiations, and strategy. In 1959, Singapore gained self-government, and at just 35 years old, Lee became prime minister. But he knew Singapore was still vulnerable, so he looked for security, not in Britain, but in a merger. In 1963, Singapore joined Malaysia, and on paper it made sense. Malaysia had land, resources, agriculture, and strength. Singapore had infrastructure and one of the best ports in Asia. Together, they could be stronger. But economics wasn't the problem. Politics was. Singapore was majority Chinese, while Malaysia's political structure was built around Malay political dominance. And then Lee pushed for something explosive, a Malaysian Malaysia, equal treatment regardless of race. To Lee, it was fairness. To many in Malaysia's leadership, it was a threat. Tensions rose, riots broke out in 1964, and by 1965, the merger was over. Malaysia expelled Singapore, not through war, not through rebellion, through separation. Singapore became independent because nobody wanted it, and when Lee announced it publicly, he cried. Not because independence was a victory, but because he understood what it meant. Singapore was now alone. No guarantee of survival. Now the real work began. At independence, Singapore looked weak. Unemployment was high, housing was poor, slums were common, and the country was still dependent on Malaysia for water. Its future looked uncertain, but Lee understood something clearly. If Singapore had no natural resources, then its people had to become the resource. That changed everything.
The administration, the organization, the metal in a people, the fiber. Don't try. That's why we got booted out, you know. If they could have just squeezed us like an orange and squeezed the juice out, I think the juice would have been squeezed out of us, and all the goodness would have been sucked away.
The first step was housing, because unstable homes create unstable societies. Through his Housing Development Board, the government began building public housing at a massive scale. Families moved from crowded wooden slums into modern apartments with clean water, electricity, and sanitation. Lee pushed technical education, practical skills, and made English the working language, not to raise identity, but to connect Singapore to the world. And in 1961, the Economic Development Board was created to attract foreign investment, and factories came, banks came, industry came. But they came for a reason. Singapore offered something rare: predictable laws, fast decisions, low corruption. Lee enforced that through the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, and trust became one of Singapore's most valuable exports. Then came industrialization. Jurong, once swampland, became factories. And under the Port of Singapore Authority, Singapore's port expanded into one of the busiest in the world. Singapore wasn't extracting wealth from the ground. It was building a system that created wealth. But Singapore's success came with trade-offs, because order wasn't accidental. It was enforced, strictly. Littering brought heavy fines. Vandalism could mean caning. Drug trafficking could mean death. To outsiders, it looked very harsh, and sometimes excessive. But Lee believed disorder spreads, corruption spreads, failure spreads. And in a country this vulnerable, small failures could become national failures. That philosophy extended to politics too. The press was tightly regulated, public protests were restricted, oppositions existed, but under pressure. Critics argue that Singapore traded freedom for efficiency, and in some ways it did.
They decided, okay, it isn't worth the fight. Why? Because they know they'll lose. They know that I'm prepared to ground the airline. They know that I can get the airline going again without them. And let there be no mistakes about this. Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him, or give it up. This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine. I've spent a whole lifetime building this. And as long as I'm in charge, nobody's going to knock it down.
But the results were too difficult to ignore. Low corruption, low crime, reliable transit, efficient government, a functioning state. And Singapore became one of the clearest examples of a difficult question. How much freedom are people willing to trade for stability? There still isn't a universal answer, but Singapore forces the question. What makes Singapore important isn't just that it succeeded, it's how it succeeded. Because if you looked at Singapore in 1965, it was not the obvious choice. Not over Malaysia, not over Indonesia. They had more land, more resources, more natural advantages. But Singapore proves something important. Resources create opportunity, but systems decide what happens to them. A weak system can waste abundance. A strong system can multiply scarcity. And that was Singapore's real achievement. Not simply becoming rich, but surviving long enough and building strongly enough to become rich. Now that is much harder and much more rare. History often teaches us that nations rise because of geography, wealth, or power. Singapore complicates that story, because it had very little of any of those, and it still found a way forward, not because it had more, but because it made more of what it had. And maybe that's why Lee Kuan Yew remains such a difficult figure to judge. To some he was a visionary, to others too controlling, too willing to limit freedom for stability. But whether you admire him or criticize him, his impacts are impossible to ignore, because Singapore proves something the world often forgets. Countries are not defined only by what they inherit, they are defined by what they build.